I was 15 years old when I left my family and moved alone to North America. It wasn't for a trip, nor was it for a summer camp. I packed my life into two suitcases, said goodbye to everyone I knew, and flew to a boarding school in a country I had never lived in before. I didn't fully understand what I had signed up for until I was already there. The first night, I sat in a dorm room by myself and realized something I hadn't prepared for. I didn't have my parents to debrief at the end of the day. I didn't have a single familiar face to sit next to at dinner. There was no one around who had known me before any of this. No one who could remind me of who I actually was when I felt like myself. I thought the hardest part would be the language. And yes, the language was hard, but that wasn't actually the hardest part. The hardest part was feeling completely invisible in a building full of people with no one nearby who had known me. In those first months, I handled it the way most 15-year-olds living alone for the first time would. I kept to myself. I focused on not standing out in the wrong way, getting the words right, staying quiet enough that nobody noticed how lost I was. If I could just seem normal, I thought, everything would eventually fall into place. But even as my English improved, conversation still felt off. I'd say something I thought was completely normal, and the room would go slightly flat, not hostile, just unresponsive, like I had said the words correctly but missed something underneath them. Other times, someone would say something and I would smile and nod, even though I hadn't fully understood what had just happened. It wasn't the words I was missing, it was the meaning behind them. The loneliness of that is hard to describe, but it isn't the loneliness of being alone in a room. It's the loneliness of being surrounded by people and still not being able to reach out. And the harder part was that I couldn't even call home and explain it properly. How do you tell your parents, who sacrificed to send you there, that you are struggling to make a single real connection? You don't really. You say you're fine, and then you go back to figuring it out on your own. What I didn't understand was that this feeling had nothing to do with how smart I was or how hard I was trying. It was something else entirely. People don't just differ in how they speak, they differ in what they find funny, what they consider rude, what they consider warm, and what a friendship is even supposed to look like for them. These things get absorbed over years of growing up somewhere. When you arrive alone at 15, without your family, without your people, without any of your old context, you feel the absence of that absorbed knowledge in every single interaction. The real issue, as I eventually came to understand, was assumption. Back home, communication had felt effortless, not because I was particularly skilled at it, but because everyone around me shared the same invisible framework we all knew without thinking about it. What a joke was supposed to land like, how to show respect without being stiff, how much silence was comfortable before it became awkward. When I moved, I brought that framework with me. I kept expecting things to work the same way, and when they didn't, I assumed the problem was me, that I wasn't smart enough, or interesting enough, or likable enough to fit in. But that wasn't it. The real problem was that I was working with a map that didn't match the territory. I was applying one culture's unspoken rules to a completely different environment and then wondering why I kept getting lost. When your assumptions match the person you're talking to, communication feels effortless. But when they don't, even slightly, the same words start producing different results than you intended. And the frustrating part is that you often can't see where the mismatch is happening, which makes it very easy to blame yourself. Well, over time, which it did take time, something shifted. I stopped trying to figure out the right thing to say. I started getting genuinely curious about how the people around me actually see things, what mattered to them, how they were reading situations, and what they needed from a conversation that I might not have been giving. That shift sounds small, but it changed everything. Because once you are actually trying to understand someone else's perspective, you stop treating every interaction like a test you might fail. It becomes less about performing correctly and more about navigating together. Two people making small adjustments toward each other until something real starts to happen. That's when I finally started to feel less invisible. Looking back, there are a few specific things that made the biggest difference, and I think they apply well beyond the migrant experience. The first one is this: people don't respond to your words, they respond to what your words mean to them. The same sentence can feel warm, or cold, or even offensive, depending entirely on who's receiving it and the context they bring to it. So the question worth asking isn't, did I say that correctly? The more useful question is, how might they hear that? Two questions lead to very different conversations. The second thing is that interest isn't universal. Not everyone wants the same kind of exchange. Some people find energy in fast, direct conversation, while others need more space and pacing to feel more comfortable. Some people read directness as honesty and respect it. Others read that directness as aggression and close off. When I was a teenager, I sometimes came across too quiet, too reserved, because the way I had learned to show interest back home didn't translate here. I wasn't cold, I just hadn't learned how to express warmth in a way that registered, and that gap cost me more connection than I realized at the time. The third thing is that adjusting to someone doesn't mean losing yourself. This matters because I think a lot of people, especially when they're young, especially when they're already feeling like an outsider, worry that adapting means that they're disappearing. Well, it doesn't. What you're actually doing is finding overlap, the place where your communication and theirs can meet without either of you having to pretend. That might mean slowing down or having a bit more direct, or asking a question instead of making a statement. A small shift, not a transformation of who you are. And the fourth thing is that curiosity works better than trying to seem impressive. When I was 15, 16, 17, most of my energy went into not standing out in the wrong way, trying to seem normal, trying to prove that I belong. That effort, ironically, kept me at a distance from people. What actually worked eventually was genuine interest in how someone else thinks, what they care about, and why something matters to them. When people feel like they are actually trying to understand them, something opens up that no amount of careful language can create on its own. And I want to be clear, you don't have to move countries alone at 15 like me to know this feeling. You encounter versions of it constantly. When you start a new job where the culture is different from anywhere you've been before, when you're in a relationship with someone who grew up with completely different assumptions about how closeness works or how conflict gets handled, when you're the only person in the room who doesn't share the same background as everyone else. Anytime you're trying to connect with someone who sees the world differently than you do, this is the skill that determines whether you actually reach each other or whether you both leave feeling like the conversation didn't quite land. I just learned it earlier than most of you, and in a harder way than I would have chosen to. If conversations feel difficult sometimes, if you find yourself saying the right words and still not getting through, it's probably not because something is wrong with you. It's more likely that you're talking to someone who's working from a different set of assumptions, a different picture of what a normal exchange looks like. And that gap, the space between how you see things and how they see things, isn't a flaw to fix. It's just the reality of talking to another person who is genuinely different from you. I spent years as a teenager feeling like that gap meant I didn't belong, and now I understand it differently. Real communication doesn't happen when people are identical. It happens when they're different, and they still find a way to understand each other, not by saying